The belly arrived in your 50s and resisted everything you tried. Caloric restriction moved weight from the arms, the face, the legs, the belly stayed. Exercise thinned the limbs, improved the stamina, changed nothing at the waistline. You ate less. You moved more. The belly remained as though it were operating under different rules than the rest of the body. The physician said visceral fat. The recommendation was the same one you had been following. Eat less, move more. The belly did not respond to the recommendation because the recommendation targeted caloric balance, and the belly was running on a loop that caloric balance alone could not interrupt. It was operating under different rules. Visceral fat, the fat packed around the organs behind the abdominal wall, contains an enzyme that converts inactive cortisol circulating in the blood into active cortisol inside each fat cell. The fat is not storing cortisol. The fat is manufacturing it locally, continuously, independently of stress, independently of the adrenal glands, 24 hours a day. The active cortisol the fat produces drives more fat storage at the same site. The new fat contains the same enzyme. The factory expands itself. More fat means more enzyme means more cortisol means more fat. The loop tightens with every kilogram of visceral tissue added. Belly that resisted every intervention was running a self-reinforcing cycle through an enzyme, a portal vein that delivers the cortisol directly to the liver before the rest of the body sees it, and a hippocampus that was weakening under the load of the molecule the fat was making. 3 nodes. 1 loop. The physics at each node is what the diagnosis never explained. What is the enzyme, and how does the fat manufacture cortisol from an inactive precursor? 11-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1. A membrane-bound enzyme sitting in the endoplasmic reticulum of every visceral fat cell. The enzyme catalyzes a specific chemical reaction. It takes cortisone, the inactive form of cortisol circulating in the blood, and reduces the 11-keto group to an 11-hydroxy group, converting the molecule inactive to biologically active. The reaction requires NADPH as a cofactor, supplied by the hexose monophosphate shunt running in the same endoplasmic reticulum membrane. Each fat cell runs this conversion independently. Each fat cell produces active cortisol from the inactive precursor already circulating in the bloodstream. No adrenal signal required. No stress trigger required. The distinction is significant. The cortisol your adrenal glands produce in response to stress is episodic, rising and falling with the stressor, regulated by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The cortisol your visceral fat produces is constitutive, running at a steady rate determined by the enzyme concentration and the substrate availability, both of which are constant. The adrenal contribution fluctuates. The visceral contribution runs baseline, adding its output to whatever the adrenals produce, 24 hours a day, every day, without the peaks and troughs the stress axis generates. The substrate is always present because cortisone circulates continuously at stable concentrations. The enzyme runs whenever the substrate is available. The factory never shuts down. While you sleep, while you fast, while you exercise, while you do everything the protocol recommends, the enzyme continues converting cortisone to cortisol inside every visceral fat cell because the substrate never stops circulating and the enzyme never stops running. The production is constitutive, built into the cellular machinery, not triggered by any external event. The fat cell is a cortisol factory the way the thyroid is a thyroxine factory. It produces its product as a continuous function of its existence. If you reduce stress through meditation, therapy, and lifestyle changes, you address the adrenal cortisol, the episodic component. The visceral cortisol, the constitutive component, continued running because the enzyme does not respond to stress reduction. It responds to substrate availability and enzyme quantity, both of which remain unchanged regardless of how calm you feel. Reducing stress helps. Shrinking the factory addresses the component stress reduction cannot reach. Throughput scales linearly with the fat mass. Each additional visceral fat cell adds its own endoplasmic reticulum membrane, its own complement of 11-beta-HSD1 enzyme molecules, its own NADPH supply. 10 kilograms of visceral fat produces more local cortisol than 5 kilograms. 20 produces more than 10. The total enzyme activity across the visceral depot increases in direct proportion to the tissue mass, which means the cortisol production capacity of the belly grows with the belly. Arteriovenous sampling studies measuring cortisol concentration in blood entering and leaving the visceral fat depot confirm net cortisol release. The blood leaving the depot carries higher cortisol concentration than the blood entering it. The depot is a net cortisol producer, measurably adding active cortisol to the portal circulation with every pass of blood through the tissue. The output builds the factory. The factory increases the output. 11-beta-HSD1 activity in visceral adipose tissue and its role in local cortisol amplification is established endocrinology. 11-beta-HSD1 converts cortisone to cortisol within adipose tissue at rates measurable through arteriovenous sampling across the visceral fat depot. Tomlinson and colleagues established this in endocrine reviews. The kidney runs the opposite enzyme, 11-beta-HSD type 2, which converts active cortisol to inactive cortisone, protecting the mineralocorticoid receptor from cortisol activation. The two enzymes are molecular mirrors. One activates, one deactivates. Visceral fat expresses the activating enzyme. The kidney expresses the deactivating enzyme. The direction of conversion depends on which enzyme the tissue carries, and the visceral fat carries the one that produces active cortisol from every molecule of inactive cortisone the blood delivers. A factory that builds itself. The product of the factory is the building material for more factory. Each expansion of the visceral depot floor adds manufacturing capacity that produces more product that builds more floor. The loop has no internal brake. The only input that slows it is reducing the cortisol source's size, and the enzyme compartment is the hardest fat depot to shrink because the cortisol it produces preferentially directs fat storage back to the visceral compartment. I experienced the production site analogy differently the week the enzyme arithmetic replaced the phrase stubborn belly fat in my understanding of my own waistline. The belly was not stubbornly storing calories. The belly was actively manufacturing a hormone that directed more storage to the same site. Every kilogram of visceral fat I carried was a manufacturing unit producing its own cortisol, driving its own growth, operating on its own substrate supply without requiring any signal from the adrenal glands. The belly was active production. Enzyme produces the cortisol drives the storage expands the enzyme capacity. But the loop runs specifically through visceral fat and not through subcutaneous fat for a reason the anatomy explains, a reason that traces to the plumbing between the belly and the liver. Why does this loop run through visceral fat specifically, and why does the liver receive the cortisol first? Portal vein. Visceral fat drains its venous blood into the hepatic portal vein, the same vessel that carries absorbed nutrients from the intestine to the liver. The portal vein delivers its contents to the liver before they enter the general circulation. Every molecule of cortisol the visceral fat produces through 11-beta-HSD1 enters the portal blood and arrives at the liver at portal concentration, undiluted by the full blood volume, before the rest of the body sees it. Concentration difference matters. Portal blood delivers cortisol to the liver at concentrations 2 to 3 times higher than what the same amount of cortisol would produce if it were diluted into the full systemic circulation. The liver receives a concentrated cortisol signal from the visceral fat. The liver's glucocorticoid receptors respond to the local portal concentration, not the systemic average. The liver sees a different cortisol world than the rest of the body because the plumbing delivers visceral cortisol undiluted. Subcutaneous fat on the abdomen, the fat you can pinch with your fingers above the muscle wall, drains into the systemic circulation. Visceral fat, the fat packed behind the muscle wall around the intestines, liver, and kidneys, drains into the portal vein. Both deposits sit in the same anatomical region of the body. Both contribute to waist circumference. Only one delivers its cortisol to the liver at concentrated levels. The distinction between subcutaneous and visceral belly fat is vascular. The portal connection is what makes visceral fat metabolically dangerous beyond its caloric content. The subcutaneous fat on the arms, the thighs, the hips drains into the systemic venous circulation, where any cortisol it produces is immediately diluted across the full blood volume. The liver never sees a concentrated signal from subcutaneous fat. The portal plumbing is why visceral fat matters more than subcutaneous fat for the metabolic consequences. The same cortisol production from the same enzyme hits the liver harder from the visceral depot because the plumbing delivers it undiluted. Portal vein drainage of visceral fat and its metabolic consequences to first pass hepatic cortisol exposure is established vascular physiology. Anatomical relationship between visceral adipose tissue and the portal circulation produces hepatic cortisol exposure disproportionate to total cortisol production. Wajkenberg described this portal hypothesis in Endocrine Reviews. Now, the cortisol arrives at the liver through the portal pipeline. The liver responds to cortisol by increasing gluconeogenesis, manufacturing glucose from amino acids and glycerol, and releasing it into the bloodstream. The liver, whose insulin receptors had downregulated, was already failing to suppress glucose production. Here, the same liver receives an additional input, cortisol, from the visceral fat, arriving through the portal vein at concentrated levels, stimulating glucose production through the glucocorticoid receptor pathway independently of and in addition to the insulin resistance that was already operating. Two inputs driving hepatic glucose production. The cortisol activates gluconeogenesis through the glucocorticoid receptor on hepatocytes, upregulating the enzymes that convert amino acids and glycerol into glucose. The liver produces glucose and releases it into the bloodstream. Overnight, when you are fasting and the insulin level is at its lowest, the portal cortisol continues arriving and the liver continues producing glucose in response. The fasting glucose number that was higher than you expected traces partly to this overnight hepatic cortisol exposure from the visceral depot producing and draining active cortisol through the portal vein while you slept. The insulin signal that should suppress it was already weakened by receptor downregulation. The cortisol signal that drives it is now amplified by portal concentration delivery. The fasting glucose climbs through two converging mechanisms at the same organ. Well, the portal arithmetic reframed the fasting glucose number I had been interpreting as a single-cause problem. The morning number was not just the liver ignoring insulin because the receptors had downregulated. It was the liver simultaneously receiving a concentrated cortisol signal through the portal vein from the visceral fat, a signal that actively drives glucose production through a completely independent receptor pathway. Two causes, one number. The insulin resistance discussion taught one cause. This is the second. The cortisol arrives at the liver and drives glucose production. The cortisol also circulates systemically and blocks glucose entry into muscle cells through a mechanism that compounds insulin resistance. How does cortisol block glucose entry independently of insulin resistance? Double GLUT4 blockade. Receptor downregulation is one block. The cell pulling insulin receptors off the surface through chronic overstimulation, reducing the signal that triggers GLUT4 translocation. Cortisol adds a second block through a completely independent mechanism. It enters the cell nucleus, binds the glucocorticoid receptor, and the receptor cortisol complex suppresses the transcription of the GLUT4 gene itself. Fewer GLUT4 channels are manufactured. Even when the insulin signal does get through the remaining receptors and triggers the translocation cascade, fewer channels are available to move to the surface because fewer were produced. Two independent blocks. Same glucose entry pathway. Block 1, fewer insulin receptors to trigger the translocation signal. Block 2, fewer GLUT4 channels to translocate even when the signal arrives. The muscle cell with both blocks has reduced receptor count and reduced channel inventory. The combined effect is multiplicative rather than additive. If insulin resistance reduces translocation signaling by 50% and cortisol reduces channel availability by 30%, the net glucose entry is not reduced by 80%, but by 65%, because the 30% channel reduction applies to the already reduced 50% signal. The mathematics of compound blockade produces glucose impairment that exceeds what either mechanism would produce alone. Glucose entry is impaired through two mechanisms simultaneously, each one compounding the other, each one operating through a different molecular pathway. If you carry both visceral fat and insulin resistance, your muscle cells are receiving glucose through a door that is both harder to signal open, fewer receptors, and has fewer hinges, fewer channels. The glucose monitor reading that stays elevated longer after a meal is measuring the combined effect of both blocks operating simultaneously on every muscle cell in the body. Cortisol drives glucose production at the liver and blocks glucose entry at the muscle. The combination produces the elevated blood glucose that drives more insulin secretion, which drives more receptor downregulation, which drives more insulin, which drives more fat storage, which drives more enzyme, which drives more cortisol. The nodes connect into a web rather than a simple loop, each one feeding multiple other nodes simultaneously. And then, the cortisol that the visceral fat produces through 11-beta-HSD1 circulates beyond the liver and the muscle. It reaches the brain, and at the brain, it weakens the structure that applies the brake on the entire stress axis. How does cortisol weaken the hippocampal brake? Hippocampus applies negative feedback on the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. When cortisol levels rise, hippocampal neurons detect the elevation through glucocorticoid receptors and send inhibitory signals to the hypothalamus, suppressing further cortisol release. The hippocampus is the brake pedal on cortisol production. Press the brake, cortisol output decreases. Release the brake, cortisol output increases. Sustained cortisol exposure damages the brake. Cortisol binds glucocorticoid receptors on hippocampal neurons, and chronic activation of these receptors triggers dendritic retraction. The branching extensions of the neuron physically withdraw, pulling back from their synaptic partners over days to weeks of sustained exposure, reducing the number of synaptic connections the neuron maintains. Each retracted dendrite represents lost connections to other neurons in the hippocampal circuit, and each lost connection reduces the circuit's capacity to apply the inhibitory feedback that constitutes the brake. The retraction is graded. More cortisol exposure produces more retraction, produces more brake weakening. The names discussion described hippocampal retrieval speed depending on synaptic density, the parallel search paths the processor runs through during memory recall. Cortisol-driven dendritic retraction reduces those parallel paths. The hippocampus loses processing capacity. The brake weakens because the structure that applies the brake has simplified its architecture. If you are experiencing worsening memory, increasing difficulty with names and word retrieval, the sense that cognitive sharpness has declined more than age alone would predict, you may be experiencing cortisol-driven dendritic retraction at the same hippocampus that runs parallel searches through synaptic connections during recall. Fewer dendrites means fewer connections means fewer parallel search paths means slower retrieval. The cognitive decline and the belly fat may share a mechanism. Simultaneously, chronic cortisol suppresses neurogenesis in the dentate gyrus. New neurons that would normally be born and integrate into the hippocampal circuit are not produced. The population that maintains the brake's processing capacity is not replenished. The brake weakens further. Glucocorticoid-driven hippocampal dendritic retraction and suppressed neurogenesis through sustained cortisol exposure is established neuroscience. Hippocampal neurons are selectively vulnerable to glucocorticoid excess. Sapolsky documented this vulnerability in biological psychiatry. Chronic stress produces measurable reductions in hippocampal dendritic complexity. McEwen confirmed this remodeling mechanism in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. Brake weakens. The cortisol that should be suppressed by the brake stays elevated. The elevated cortisol continues driving visceral fat storage, which continues producing more cortisol through 11-beta-HSD1, which continues weakening the brake. The loop tightens because the structure that would have loosened it is being damaged by the molecule the loop produces. Memory difficulties and belly fat are two symptoms of one loop, connected through the cortisol the visceral depot produces and the dendrites the hippocampus retracts under sustained exposure. What else does the visceral depot produce? Beyond cortisol, visceral fat functions as an endocrine organ that secretes inflammatory signals continuously. Tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin-6, and monocyte chemoattractant protein 1 are produced constitutively by visceral adipocytes, with output scaling proportionally to fat mass. The inflammatory output drains through the same portal vein pipeline, hitting the liver at concentrated levels, driving the production of C-reactive protein through a specific signaling cascade. Interleukin-6 binds its receptor on the hepatocyte surface, activating the JAK-STAT3 pathway inside the liver cell, which drives transcription of the C-reactive protein gene. The CRP the liver produces enters the bloodstream and the blood test measures it. The elevated high-sensitivity CRP on your lab report traces through a specific signaling chain from the visceral fat to the portal vein to the hepatocyte receptor to the gene transcription event that produced the protein the test detected. If your high-sensitivity CRP is elevated and your visceral fat distribution is significant, the blood test is measuring the cortisol source's inflammatory output arriving at the liver through the portal pipeline. The CRP reading is not a mystery. Inflammation from an unknown source. It is the visceral fat's constitutive secretory activity, quantified in a blood test, delivered through the same plumbing that carries the cortisol. Cortisol paradox. Cortisol at high acute doses is anti-inflammatory. The mechanism behind cortisone injections that reduce joint swelling. Cortisol at chronic low doses, the output 11-beta-HSD1 produces continuously, sensitizes inflammatory pathways through NF-kappa B rather than suppressing them. The same molecule produces opposite effects depending on the dose and duration. The visceral fat's chronic low-dose output drives inflammation rather than reducing it. One contributor among several, the evidence for the cortisol visceral fat loop is established in pathological cortisol elevation, where Cushing syndrome produces central obesity through precisely this mechanism. In normal range cortisol variation, the loop's magnitude as an independent driver of visceral fat accumulation varies between individuals and operates alongside diet, sleep quality, physical activity, genetic predisposition, and hormonal changes of aging. Cushing syndrome sits at the extreme end of the spectrum where the physics is undeniable. Pathological cortisol elevation produces visceral obesity through exactly this loop. The normal range variation sits at the other end, where the loop contributes alongside multiple other factors whose relative importance differs from person to person. The physics is real. The enzyme exists. The conversion is measurable. The portal plumbing is anatomical fact. The loop runs. Its contribution relative to other factors is individual, and framing it as the cause rather than one cause would overstate what the evidence supports. What shrinks the enzyme compartment? 3 inputs targeting 3 nodes of the loop. Reduce systemic cortisol. Morning light exposure within 30 minutes of waking anchors the cortisol circadian rhythm through the melanopsin suprachiasmatic nucleus pathway, ensuring the cortisol peak arrives at the appropriate time and the trough reaches its full depth overnight. Adequate slow-wave sleep reduces overnight cortisol through mechanisms the sleep architecture literature has established. Meal spacing, 3 meals without snacking, reduces the insulin-cortisol pairing that frequent eating produces. Each meal triggers both an insulin spike and a cortisol response as part of the metabolic processing. More eating events per day means more cortisol pulses layered onto the baseline the visceral fat is already producing. 3 meals provides 3 cortisol events with recovery windows between them. 6 to 8 eating events eliminates the recovery windows and produces a flatter, higher cortisol baseline that compounds the 11-beta-HSD1 output. Bypass the GLUT4 blockade. Walking after meals activates the AMPK pathway that deploys GLUT4 channels to the cell surface without requiring either the insulin receptor, the cell removed, or the GLUT4 channels cortisol suppressed. The exercise bypass clears glucose while both chemical blockades remain in place. The walking does not fix either blockade. It routes around both. The AMPK-mediated GLUT4 translocation operates through a signaling cascade that is completely independent of both the insulin receptor and the cortisol-regulated gene transcription. Muscle contraction activates AMPK directly through the energy sensing the contraction produces. The channels move to the surface because the muscle demanded them, not because insulin signaled for them. Both blocks remain in place. The glucose enters anyway. The walk after each meal is the single intervention that addresses the glucose problem without requiring either blocked pathway to recover first. Shrink the production site itself. Zone 2 aerobic exercise preferentially mobilizes visceral fat because visceral adipocytes carry higher beta-adrenergic receptor density than subcutaneous adipocytes, making them more responsive to the catecholamine-driven lipolysis exercise triggers. The fat that produces the most cortisol is the fat most responsive to exercise-induced mobilization. The specificity is pharmacological. Beta-adrenergic receptors on visceral adipocytes bind norepinephrine released during exercise, activating hormone-sensitive lipase, which breaks stored triglycerides into fatty acids the bloodstream carries to muscles for oxidation. Visceral fat responds to this signal more aggressively than subcutaneous fat because the receptor density is higher, meaning the same exercise intensity produces greater lipolysis from the visceral depot. 30 to 45 minutes of sustained Zone 2 effort, the intensity at which you can maintain a conversation but prefer not to, produces the catecholamine release the visceral receptors respond to. As visceral mass decreases, total 11-beta-HSD1 capacity decreases, local cortisol production decreases, and the loop weakens proportionally. Now the hippocampus rebuilds. Dendritic retraction reverses when cortisol exposure drops and stays low consistently. Neurogenesis resumes when cortisol falls and brain-derived neurotrophic factor rises from exercise. Hippocampal volume increased approximately 2% from 1 year of aerobic walking. In adults over 55, Erickson and colleagues measured this volume increase in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The volume increase represents partly dendritic regrowth and resumed neurogenesis recovering from cortisol suppression. The brake strengthens. The loop loosens. The 2% hippocampal volume increase from 1 year of walking represents a measurable structural recovery at the organ level, visible on MRI, correlating with improved performance on spatial memory tasks that depend on hippocampal function. The recovery is real and measurable. The timeline is months to a year, not weeks, because dendritic regrowth and neurogenesis are biological construction projects that proceed at cellular speed. And then, the timeline. Recovery requires sustained change, months rather than weeks, because dendritic regrowth and neurogenesis operate on biological timescales that cannot be rushed. The dendrites that retracted over years of sustained cortisol exposure regrow over months of reduced exposure. New hippocampal neurons that were suppressed require weeks to be born, additional weeks to migrate, and further weeks to extend dendrites and form the synaptic connections that integrate them into the functional circuit. The visceral depot that expanded over a decade does not shrink in a month, but the direction is consistent and measurable. Visceral fat decreasing, fasting cortisol decreasing, inflammatory markers decreasing, hippocampal volume increasing, memory function improving. The measurements tracked the loop running in reverse, and the direction carried different weight the month. The visceral circumference, the fasting cortisol, and the inflammatory markers all move together. Each measurement tracks a different node of the loop, and all move in the recovery direction when the inputs are sustained. The measurements are the feedback loop running in reverse. As the cortisol source shrinks, each subsequent measurement shows less cortisol, less inflammation, less glucose, more hippocampal volume. The loop that tightened over a decade loosens over months when the inputs consistently reduce the enzyme compartment size faster than the production site can rebuild. Whether your visceral fat distribution, fasting cortisol, inflammatory markers, or metabolic profile requires clinical intervention, medication, or lifestyle modification is a determination your physician makes through evaluation of your specific metabolic panel. The physics teaches how the loop runs through each node. The physician determines what your specific profile requires. If your waist circumference exceeds 40 inches for men or 35 for women, and your fasting cortisol, inflammatory markers, or fasting insulin are elevated, the loop described in this physics may be contributing. The degree of its contribution relative to dietary pattern, sleep quality, activity level, and genetic factors is what the clinical evaluation determines. The visceral depot produced the cortisol. The cortisol expanded the cortisol source. The brake that should have stopped it weakened under the load. The contribution of this loop relative to diet, sleep, activity, and genetics varies between individuals. The reversal begins when the enzyme compartment shrinks faster than the production site can rebuild itself.